I'd like to invite all the four speakers up to the table, and we'll have a little Q&A. Thank you all for your talks. Archives of American Art and Daedalus, how, in broader terms, the archival collections have helped frame your arguments.
Yeah, thanks for that. Can you hear me? Does this work, okay? Okay. Yeah, I've had so many different archives I was working with. It was really disappointing to me that I couldn't fit in more of my research at the archives, more discursive kind of interviews and oral histories, correspondence with critics, galleries, things like that. And for me, it was absolutely indispensable in informing my argument that what Motherwell was, or just giving me context for what Motherwell was doing in his book as a sort of retrospection. And maybe it's also a kind of danger of working in the Archives of American Art, which is full of these interviews of various artists, that when one works on the later work, considering late Motherwell, the tendency is to see him as, see the work as looking back in the same way that he is in his many interviews, because of course people are so entranced and curious about this early Motherwell, and so he was very, I believe, conscious of his thinking and his early work when he was doing his late work, maybe because he was talking to these figures who were so interested in him. So that's one way. The other thing I wanted to add is that there was one aspect of the archives that actually prevented me from making maybe a spurious historical argument. I became very interested, I think, after looking at these, or kind of being tuned into these textiles in Alla Pintura. I became interested in his work with Gloria Frankenthaler-Ross, who had translated some of his his compositions into textiles. And so I was sort of leaning in that direction, like Motherwell is becoming more environmental in his focus through his use of textiles in Alla Pintura, but it turned out he was kind of annoyed by the whole process, and so I think it helped shape my argument in various ways.
Yeah, I'm still actually trying to kind of sift through a lot of the material that I was that I researched this summer, but in fact, I'm wanting to do a larger book on Motherwell and American poetry, going all the way from maybe the late 30s through the 1960s, and really looking at how I think this interest in pragmatism and American poetics is a tradition that extended, again, from the late 30s up through the 60s with the New York School poets. So my research, again, was very broad, and like I said, I'm still trying to go through and I think kind of make sense of a lot of the material that I found. But to give you an example of again, kind of getting excited about things I was finding, I was looking at, for example, the Jane Freilicher papers. Jane Freilicher was one of the painters that was very close to the New York School poets. And I also looked at the John Bernard Meyer papers. And he was involved with View magazine, and during the period that I think that he was involved with View magazine, he actually wrote an unpublished essay on William James. So again, I just think there was a broader interest in pragmatism within the New York avant-garde, again, starting in the 30s up through, again, maybe through the 60s. So the research just really confirmed, I think, some of my just some of my hunches on some of these interconnections between pragmatism and American poetry. And then in terms of the Dedalus Foundation, just being able to go through his library and go through papers, and again, just confirming, again, hoping to find, certain kinds of evidence. For example, and I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce his name correctly, Glenn MacLeod wrote a book on Wallace Stevens and the visual arts, and he wrote Motherwell in the early 80s. And there was a very thick file of correspondence back and forth between MacLeod and Motherwell. And in fact, I think he sent Motherwell a questionnaire. And Motherwell was responding to these questions on Wallace Stevens. And what's kind of interesting is that Motherwell kind of downplays his interest in Stevens. So I'm trying to kind of, I'm not quite sure what to make of that, except he was asking him, about his thoughts on Stevens, 40 years later. So I think, part of that is just, I think, it had been 40 years since he probably had that stronger interest, that initial interest in Stevens. But there's, I think, as I said, there's this whole dossier of correspondence that I'm going through, which I think, again, is going to be really important for me to really substantiate some points that I'm wanting to make.
I'm sorry I don't have anything intelligent to say about this, but my basic point would be you can find things in the archives you can't find anywhere else, right? Not everything is online yet. It'll never be. That is nice. Two, everything's in one place, so you can really cross-reference and get a sense of what was going on in the different aspects of Robert Motherwell's life at a given time. And then I would say that there's just always the serendipitous find, I think, where you see something underneath something else and you put them together, which you wouldn't have thought of had you not been there in situ, I guess. So that's why I love the archive. That's why you have to go.
Yeah, I was just going to say, maybe just add one thing in terms of finding material that I think, coming up with ideas that I hadn't anticipated. I do think Motherwell had a stronger connection to that community of poets in New York in the 50s and 60s, and what kind of confirmed that is that I found these letters from these young poets that were writing him. And so I think it's just clear that I think that he had, again, just more of an active connection to that circle than has really been written about. So.
Tim, do you want to respond to that? Yeah, yes, Jack. Yes.
I would just say in terms of, say, research on the catalog raisonné, there's no there's nothing better than going to the original material. I mean, seeing the documents in person, just as seeing a painting in person is there's nothing better than that. I mean, you can't understand a painting without experiencing it in person, and having the opportunity to look at them over and over a course of several years was, what taught us about Motherwell, and same with actually going into the documents, because you can find these handwritten notes or a note on the back of something. And I think it just, basically I would say just always leave your assumptions at the door and try to go back and actually see how history was sort of constructed in the moment, instead of, just to confirm what you maybe thought you knew or something. So.
Jack?
Jack.
I just wanted to say, I think that what Gregory Gilbert saying, it points to something very important, including the fact that elegies came out of a poem. We don't think of Harold Rosenberg as a poet now, but Rosenberg saw himself as a poet at that time. And also, Motherwell was a great admirer of, and I remember correctly, fairly close personally for a while to Delmore Schwartz, who, Schwartz, when I was an undergraduate, was still being read and discussed. He won his reputation weren't shown publicly until March of '69.
I haven't found the letter that says that, or the invitation by Motherwell. Sorry. I haven't found a direct connection where Motherwell says, come over and look at these. But I'm thinking more and more that Shapiro did see them before they were shown. Because, you know, he's interested, Shapiro is interested in this topic with medieval manuscripts, and he's always been interested in this. But I think this essay, it becomes more abstract. You know, he's not thinking specifically of an artist, but just these general, more, again, diagrammatic instances where the field and the frame can be theorized visually. And that's precisely what Motherwell is doing, at least in my opinion, in his open series. To be continued, I guess.
I don't know of any recorded instance of Shapiro visiting the studio, but it's worth another look. Back to the date books and.
Are there other questions? Yes.
Did Motherwell illustrate any other works by Alberti or any other poets of that generation?
Alla Pintura was the first book he illustrated, but it spurred a lot of sort of a ripple effect. There was never, again, I think he was very conscious of his time after that, and he never again put so much of his formal kind of heart and soul into a work. So first of all, Alberti wrote a poem about him called Negro Motherwell in the immediate aftermath. Then he illustrated a book by poems by Octavio Paz. So yes, similar sort of, I think, from Motherwell's perspective, Spanish language and such, but nothing again of the generation of 1927 that Alberti had taken part of. There was Ulysses afterwards, but if that answers your question.
I have a question for you. I have to take advantage. I have to take advantage of having you next to me here.
I have a question for you, too.
Okay, good. You mentioned Jean Val, the philosopher, who was active in the Nouvelle Revue Française, I believe. And Robert Motherwell has always had this connection with France. But he also did 2 collages, I think they're in the Whitney, for the NRF, the Nouvelle Revue Française. And I also know this is, I don't know if you have a copy of this in the Dedalus Foundation, but there's a very important French writer who was the editor of the Nouvelle Revue Française, Jean Paulhan. And he wrote a response to Motherwell's 1944 essay, The Artist's, what is it? The Artist's Modern World? Or the Modern Painter's World. It's a very interesting essay. It hasn't been translated, but what is the connection with that literary journal or with John Ball?
Ken, I don't know. You know, I was going to say that is an area that I need to research, you know, more extensively. Well, for example, another possible Jean Wall connection is that, you know, Stevens and Motherwell both gave lectures at Mount Holyoke for the Pontigny lecture series in the early 40s. And Jean Wall also spoke and was there. So I don't know if they had, so I'm not sure if they met each other at that time, but that's something that I really need to look into, because I think Jean Wall is another important figure in this reception of pragmatism, both in France, but I think also in the United States. For example, he was translating American poets in France, but as you said, I think there was a lot of kind of cultural interchange between both sides. And so I think Wall is a really important figure that I'm going to need to look at. Well, can I ask you a question, Monica? I was just curious with your research on the Shapiro-Motherwell connection, if you found any information on the fact that Shapiro had been a student of Dewey's, had taken classes with Dewey, and I think at that famous exchange between Derrida and Shapiro at Columbia, again, Shapiro, I think, took umbrage at the way that Derrida was, at some points that he had made about, I think, the whole Heidegger-Shapiro exchange. And I think all Shapiro did was he stood up and he gave this very cryptic retort where he said, I was a student of Dewey's, and I believe in the truth. And that's all he said. But I was just wondering, I just wondered if you think there might be more of some of the pragmatist influence on Motherwell might have possibly been reinforced by Shapiro. I was just curious about that.
I think you're right. I think that's a shared interest. And I think Shapiro was probably pretty kind not to say anything worse than to Derrida than that. I believe in the truth, because I don't think Derrida was very kind to him at that exchange. Yeah, so I would say that they had a shared appreciation of Dewey, absolutely. I'll stop there.
Okay, no, I was going to say, Molly Nesbitt did a book maybe about 6 or 7 years ago on pragmatism, and there's a section where she does talk about Shapiro. And Kent, I haven't had a chance to read it very thoroughly yet, but so I have a lot of work still to do on this topic. But I think that, again, the possible reinforcement from Shapiro with Motherwell's interest in pragmatism is an area that
There is a dissertation in progress at Berkeley on Shapiro and pragmatism. So I can tell you the scholar's name.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yes?
I have a question. I understand a lot of the artists come to Shapiro's talks. Did Motherwell continue to go to some of his talks? Do you know about that?
He did, but Motherwell got too busy, I think, to keep up with that. So that we have later the letters, there's more space between the letters, space and time, that is. And then the letter where he says to Meyer Shapiro, "You were the most decisive person in my life," is right after he misses some lecture that Shapiro gives at Columbia. So he's saying, "I'm sorry, and here's what, don't be offended I wasn't there, because here's what I really think." So we see more of that later, and it's just because Motherwell is traveling and he's busy, and they do grow further apart as they get older, but their friendship remains, I would say.
Was Motherwell able to avoid the draft, given that 40 to 46 was such a time for him?
Jack?
Yeah, he had asthma.
Oh, he did? Yes, so he's 4 F. Thank you. Did you guys know, did the war have any real resonating effect on his work, would you say?
On his work?
Yeah, I mean, could you see, did he talk much about it?
Yes, he used military reps in Columbus.
Right.
And post-war, there's imagery, walls of Europe imagery. So they have a pretty significant effect.
This is really obnoxious, but I wrote an article on, he did a collage called Joy of Living, and I did an article in the Oxford Art Journal about 8 years ago on, again, it's all of his interest in World War II, and I argue a World War II content to the collage. So,
In his writing, certainly, you see, as in, all of anyone living through that time, you see, this catastrophe, the world's coming to an end. What are we going to do next? Do we have to go to France or get psychoanalyzed?
Do you think he felt bad about not say this one? He's a very sensitive guy, obviously.
I don't think, specifically in the circle he was involved in, I don't think he, at that time, I mean, looking back, he may have had different feelings. But at the time, I think, particularly with the surrealists, even though they had fled Europe, there was a very, this like very strong leftist anarchist view that, to almost stand outside of that they were men of ideas. And even when Motherwell was at Harvard, he asked his advisor, he was thinking like, should I be thinking of going to fight in Spain in the Spanish Civil War? And I don't remember the exact quote, but basically David Prowl told him, no, don't go, like devote, the world needs like men devoted to truth and like, stay and like do your basically like you're on another path. But I think Motherwell is unique among the abstract expressionists for sort of his, the political commitment, and it's often deflected away. Like during World War II, he does a whole series of drawings, which he refers to as a kind of disasters series, like Goya, but the imagery is specifically inspired by the Mexican Revolution. His wife was Mexican. Her uncle and grandfather had fought in the revolution, so she had a lot of stories about that. So I mean, it's and he would emphasize that they were the images of Mexico, but they could just as easily be read. I mean, they're very violent, like explicitly violent, explicitly bloody. And there's some collages that really reflect the kind of like devastation of Europe after the war. Yeah, I spent a lot of time looking through, various magazines from that period, and you can just see that just the type of images that were around of what Europe looked like, and there was kind of constant reporting in the Partisan Review about the situation in Europe after the war. He helped, Max Ernst several times wrote and asked him to help organize shipments of food to his sister during like the Berlin blockade. So, it's complex. I think, I mean, basically, he, Pollock, Baziotes, Rothko, Newman were all stateside, during the war, and James Brooks and a lot of other painters did go, but they were the ones who ended up, not really having the career, didn't really begin showing till like after 1950, because there was that time delay. Yeah, even though like Brooks had been in New York for a long time even before Motherwell. So yeah, Milton Resnick.
Well, I want to ask Kent's question. Is that the only portrait, Jack, that Motherwell ever painted?
Yeah, there's a 1947 painting, which is a very, it's the painting is called Maria. It's a very, very dark, almost like, I guess phthalo, washes of like phthalo green. Very, very, very dark, sort of, influenced by Picasso in some way. And there's a whole series of figures in the 40s. I mean, he's basically a painter of figures in the 40s, and the collages are the most abstract, but the paintings there's a lot of figurative painting, but not of specific people. There is a very representational etching that he also did with Seligman in the spring of 41, which is called The Jewish Girl, and I mean, it's very Matisse-like drawing, or etching. Trying to think.
That's a woman that we assume that's a woman that he knew.
Yeah, we believe he sort of had a suggestion that he had sort of a romantic affair while he was a student in France with this. He was in Grenoble studying French, and it was just before just before France entered to war. He left, and was talking to all his friends, and this girl was going back to Czechoslovakia, I believe, and basically knowing like what her fate and her family's fate would be, but she wanted to return to like give her family strength. And Motherwell talks very movingly about that. I mean, there was some, there was a very definite awareness. Like it sort of ties into the previous question. I mean, he was in Paris like during one of the years when they would have had the highest number of refugees from Spain. At least for France, a very similar situation to today. And had a lot of people. I mean, some of his best friends did go up and fight in the war, but I think he was happy to. He was a good tennis player, but somehow the severe asthma got him. We have his draft card in the archives. So.
Well, I'd like to invite you all to have some refreshments now for a brief break before our second session. Thank you.